Hello and welcome to On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. On January 30th, 2019, I released the episode of And the Runner-Up Is on the 1977 Best Picture race, where we discussed Star Wars as the likely runner-up that lost Best Picture to Annie Hall. But on second thought, what if the runner-up was really Julia?
Based on a story by Lillian Hellman. A story of a friendship.
You still look like nobody else.
An adventure.
We have to talk fast now. There isn't much time.
And an act of great courage.
You are traveling to Moscow. Why do you stop in Berlin?
Jane Fonda, Vanessa Redgrave, Jason Robards, Maximilian Schell, Hal Holbrook in Julia. A true story.
Hello and welcome back to On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is, where we discuss another film nominated for Best Picture that we did not cover as the runner-up on the main show. And we're back in 1977 today, and on the main show we talked about a little movie called Star Wars as the runner-up to Annie Hall. But today we are discussing whether it could have actually been Julia, which truly could not be two different movies in so many respects. But I'm so happy to be joined by the dynamic duo who I just love having them on together. I really do. My first guest you heard talk with me about A Letter to Three Wives and the films of 1949, plus some episodes of On Second Thought about Lost in Translation, The Remains of the Day, and A Room with a View. Please welcome back programmer at Newfest and writer Murtada Elfadl.
Kevin.
Yes.
I'm so excited to be back on the podcast. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes.
And I love so much that you asked me to come back with Nicole. And I've never been part of a dynamic duo, so this is even doubly exciting for me.
Wow. Well, you've already tipped your hand as to who the other guest is. Everyone should know by now. You've heard her on the legendary 1917 episode and the films of 2019, plus some episodes of On Second Thought about The Hours and The Remains of the Day and A Room with a View from Next Best Picture. Nicole Ackman.
Thank you so much for having me back. Although I have to say, I don't think I have as many spicy opinions for today as I did last time I recorded. I don't think I can top that.
Those so many spicy takes on that one. People are still recovering. Truly. All right.
It's a classic episode. We'll have to do something to try and live up with it. Hopefully the film will help us.
Yes. I'm sure that we all have some very dynamic and interesting thoughts on Julia, which is a movie that basically, as of right now, does not have an official streaming service on which you can watch it. So it's only on home video and through other sites that you may stumble upon on the internet. So first of all, thank you both for watching and agreeing to do this. So let's just jump right in. All right. So Julia is a period drama about the famous writer Lillian Hellman and her close friendship with a woman named Julia, who she grew up with. And Julia comes from a wealthy family and decides to use her resources to help fight the Nazis in the late 1930s and early 40s in Vienna. Eventually she gets injured and Lillian comes to try and find her. And eventually Lillian becomes famous as a playwright, but still wants to find Julia. And she ends up being recruited to smuggle money into Germany to help the anti-fascists there in fighting the Nazis. So there you go. And the film was directed by Fred Zinnemann and written by Alvin Sargent, who adapted Lillian Hellman's story Pentimento. And it stars Jane Fonda as Lillian, Vanessa Redgrave as Julia, Jason Robards, Hal Holbrook, and Maximilian Schell. And Julia made $20 million at the U.S. box office. It was nominated for 11 Academy Awards, winning 3, but not Best Picture. All right, let's talk Julia. Let's start with Nicole. What are your thoughts? I know this is a first watch for you.
Yeah, this is a first watch for me. And I first of all, we'll be honest. I have a big soft spot for Jane Fonda, particularly because I spent most of the past year working on a project at my, normal 9 to 5 job for the University of Georgia about Ted Turner. Ooh. And obviously, in researching Ted Turner, I also learned a lot about Jane Fonda. So I am always super excited to like actually see her in anything. So I was very excited to watch this movie. And this is the kind of movie that really, on paper, sounds like it would be exactly my kind of film.
Yeah. And
then, I mean, I was so bored.
Oh, no.
I think, this movie does have a lot of good in it, but at the same time, it's not what I think it could have been, perhaps. I think that the performances are pretty good. It's very fun to see a young Meryl Streep. But at the same time, I think that the fact that it, centers around Lillian and not Julia as a main character kind of damns it from the beginning. Yeah, I'm very interested to really get into discussing this in depth with you guys.
Yes. All right. Well, how about you, Murtada?
So I've seen this film before. I've seen it many years ago, and I didn't remember anything about it. I remembered the one big scene, as I told you both right before we started talking. I remember the big scene, which is the meeting of Julia and Lillian, Jane Fonda and Vanessa Redgrave, and that scene it's strong, and that was the only thing that remained in my memory. And I forgot that like more than half of this movie, or is it half of it, takes place on a train, on this trip from Paris through Berlin to Moscow that Lillian takes, which is basically 100% of her activism against the Nazis is what she did on that trip, or what she carried on that trip. So I forgot all of that, and I was like, why is the train the bulk of this movie? So I agree with Nicole that it was a little bit of a hard watch. And I think I agree with Nicole also when she said the movie should have been about Julia. I think there are two better movies. One could have followed Lillian in the salons of Broadway and Paris, where she gets to hang out with all these, exciting writers and thinkers and activists, and travel from Broadway to Paris and do all her things in 1930s Europe. And the other could have followed Julia in Vienna and what she was doing in Vienna and Berlin, the real fight against the Nazis, which we don't see anything of. We just see her sitting in we do see her a little bit in the beginning, but mostly we just see her in that one scene sitting with Jane Fonda in a restaurant. That's the bulk of her activism. So anyway, but it's great to see Jane Fonda and Vanessa Redgrave in a movie frame together. I think that's very exciting.
Yeah, certainly. And this is a film that I watched for the first time for this show a few years ago, and I was very intrigued by it. I liked a lot of the players in it. The plot certainly sounded interesting. And then I ultimately watched it and definitely found myself underwhelmed. And it just didn't leave any kind of a lasting impression on me since then. So I kind of went into this rewatch with an open mind, I would say, hoping to maybe see something and appreciate something about it now that I knew what I was getting into, And I came away with it with the same feeling, unfortunately. There are a lot of interesting elements going on that you can understand why it was developed into a film in the first place. But something about it just doesn't really come together in the end. And I think my biggest problem is just how detached it can feel. And I get the sense that it's reaching for something grander than it actually ends up being. And it does have like that sheen of prestige to it, but I can't say that there's a lot beneath that. And there are moments where, like, for example, I'm really drawn in by the eeriness of it. There's like an uneasiness to a lot of scenes in the film that I think are effective, but it can also be so chilling in that regard that it puts me at more of a distance. And normally I have like a bit of a furrowed brow when somebody says a movie leaves them cold, especially when it's about relationships between women. But even in that regard, it's like they're apart for so long in this movie, and for as much as we get flashbacks to their childhood, I don't really feel the connection between them that the movie maybe wants me to, and that the movie hinges on, I would say, which is this feeling of wanting very desperately to be with someone, but there are all these obstacles in the way, and the relationship just doesn't feel as developed, I think, as it should be for me to connect with them. Having said that, I do think that Jane Fonda and Vanessa Redgrave are able to add some spark to that dynamic, but I guess they can only do so much, you know?
I mean, the bulk of the parts between Julia and Lillian are played by the younger versions, right? Like, to your point, they're in silos. Yes, we see Vanessa Redgrave. Yes, we see a lot of Jane Fonda, but not together. And we only get, I think, a couple of scenes. There is a flashback on the one big main scene, and that's it. And yes, to your point, I think it would have been nicer to see them interact a little bit more, and even the flashbacks could have been to their younger selves, and they could have played it like, I don't know, young adults or in their 20s something. I think they have one flashback in their 20s, I assume, since they were in college. Maybe you could have added one more to that, and I think the movie would have really benefited from it.
I also think that because we don't feel really a strong enough connection between these two women, it makes a lot of the plot, I don't want to say not make sense, but I think it kind of messes with the character motivations, in that I kind of spend the whole thing like, why is Lillian doing all of this? Like, because I feel like you don't feel that strong bond between the two of them the way that you need to for all of the action of the movie to really resonate.
Yeah. Well, I think this film is something that could be very interesting if it was more interested in exploring the psychological aspect of, you know, like what Julia means and what she represents to Lillian. And we certainly get hints of that, I think. And I think we're meant to come away from this thinking that Julia is just this idealistic representation of what Lillian is admiring and maybe wants to be her in the world, but is struggling to be that person.
I think it comes off almost a little bit, I'm trying not to say, the wrong word here, but almost a little bit like obsessive to a point of, there were a few times where I was like, I can't tell if this movie wants me to think that this is a toxic relationship or not. And I think the fact that it doesn't seem to like take a stance on that entirely is what was sort of frustrating to me.
Yeah. And I think also like playing what they show of Lillian in her life is not that interesting. They show her struggling to write her play, and then the play suddenly, without us really knowing what happened, is a huge success on Broadway. And then there's just a passing mention that her second play flopped. While Lillian Hellman is known as not only a writer, but an activist, a communist. She was blacklisted. She appeared before the House Committee on American Activities in the 50s. So there is more to her. And if they had shown her doing all these things that she had, I'm sure, done in the 1930s, you don't get called before Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s if you haven't done something in the 1930s, right? So she was obviously on the right side of history, whether during the war or after the war in the 50s, and sort of showing the seeds of that, because this is what Julia was actually doing, and maybe she was inspired by it. So if they had showed us that inspiration instead of what they show us of Lillian's life in the 30s, I think that movie would have been more balanced and more interesting.
Yeah. And to your earlier point, the fact that we spend so much time on the train and just that entire plot, which takes like feels like at least an hour. You know, I think a lot of that time could have been spent developing things a little more and giving us those motivations. So, yeah, I mean, there's also another scene late in the movie where there's this man who's talking to Lillian about how people know, like, all about the nature of Lillian and Julia's relationship, which certainly implies, you know, like a sexual romantic relationship, but, you know, with so much attention given to this plot to get Lillian from point A to point B, all that just feels like subtext rather than, you know, text.
Yeah,
which is
totally
fine, but I think there's just so much to explore that does not ultimately interest Fred Zinnemann, unfortunately.
I feel like there's about 1,000 interesting movies lurking somewhere in this movie, and none of them were fully committed to. Because I agree, like, I do think, you know, there obviously is a queer reading of this movie, and I think that, like, that would have made it so much more interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, if we were able to actually see the two of them together more, maybe, if, like, I hate to say it, but if they had more chemistry together whenever we do see them together, I think that maybe that would come across in a more interesting light, even with, you know, the other constraints of the film as it exists. But I do think that there was so much potential in this story that sort of did not make its way into the script.
Yeah.
And even if you read, like, I did a little bit of research to just, you know, look at, I found an expert from one of I don't know how many Jane Fonda books there are out, but one of them anyway, she talks about how she had so much respect for Vanessa Redgrave and what she was doing, not just on screen, but in her political life. And there was nobody but Julia, but Vanessa who could have played Julia, and that she really wanted to be on screen with her. And if she had said no, she doesn't think if even the movie would have been made. You know, I'm paraphrasing here, so don't hold me to this. It's, you know, but it's just like, so there is all this sort of, like, even behind the scenes, these women obviously shared, you know, had respect for each other and wanted to work together. And I just don't think it really shows in the movie. So their one scene together is dynamite. Yeah. So there's that. Yeah. There's a reason enough to watch the movie.
Yeah, that also goes back to that issue of most of the time that we actually see the characters of Lillian and Julia together, it's as young girls. And we aren't really allowed to see Jane Fonda and Vanessa Redgrave interacting that much in the film.
Though she talks about her constantly. Like, every scene is Jane Fonda talking about Julia.
Truly. Yeah, I mean, honestly, there's an interesting kind of real-life parallel there that you were touching on, that, like, even Jane Fonda named her daughter Vanessa after Vanessa Redgrave. So
I love that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a very interesting dynamic. But I wanted to also bring this up because it's been mentioned a few times in what I've read from other reviews, which is actually kind of a divisiveness about Jane Fonda being in this movie and this performance she's giving, in the sense of, was she right to play Lillian Hellman? Because Jane Fonda, incredible actress, we know this. She is a force of nature and she's able to play so many different emotions on screen. But I do wonder if she's a little too much of a force to play a role that is asking her to be very vulnerable and unsure about what she's doing, and wishes to have the strong convictions that Julia has, but is just coming up short in many ways. And when you think of Jane Fonda, she's someone who's very sure of herself and strong in her convictions. And even when she speaks, it feels like she has a conviction to her. And so I think maybe there could have been someone maybe a little bit quirkier to play that particular role, maybe with more of that acerbic edge, which is something that, for example, like Melissa McCarthy, I think captured very well in Can You Ever Forgive Me as a writer type. But with Jane Fonda, I don't know if I necessarily buy her as this character, but
I buy her as Lillian Hellman, who, you know, from, you know, what I know about Lillian Hellman and what I've read about her, I buy her as somebody who would do those things that Lillian Hellman has done in her life. I just, maybe to your point, it's not what we see in the movie. In the movie,
that's the thing. Right.
Yeah, she's very unsure of herself all of the time. I like the performance. I think she does well in the scenes where she's alone, struggling as a writer, like those scenes where the physicality of being a writer, I think she captures well in the scenes where she's trying to type, where she throws her typewriter out. All those scenes kind of worked for me. I liked her in her scenes with Jason Robards, where she's sort of like asking him to guide her, and sort of I felt the frustration of the writer. You can't really, nobody else can do the job for you. You have to just sit down and do it. And as a writer myself, I sort of felt her like sometimes she's like struggling and she takes it out on him. And I feel like in those scenes she really shined.
Yeah, I think she's really good in the scenes about her being a writer. I think she's actually very good in sort of the ending scenes of her,
Yes.
reacting to everything that has occurred. But I think what I struggle with this performance is I don't think she's as good as Jane Fonda normally is in the scenes on the train. I think she overplays the nervousness to the point that it almost comes off as almost like it's almost flirting with being campy, which does not fit in this film.
Yeah.
And I think that it is a horrible thing if we spend so much time on the train with this facet of her performance that I don't think is very good, that it does sort of bite into the fact that I think she's very good in every other scene, but the train thing just goes on for so long.
Yeah, the train. Yes, that's that train. Why the train, Fred Zinnemann? Why are we in this train, Alvin Sargent? Tell me, explain this to me. When these women are so fascinating, and then all these characters appear to just like she's so passive in that train trip. Like all these other characters appear to tell her what to do at every point. She's so passive, and I think that's maybe what you were both alluding to, that there is that can't speak. Is it pacificity? Is that the word? Whatever. Yeah. You know what I mean. Mm-hmm. To her, to the character in that scene, and it's just like, why are we following this person who just too much? Like a little bit of that would have been fine, but I don't know how long it is, frankly. But I think if the movie's 2 hours, it felt like an hour of it was the train. But I'm sure it's less because there's a lot more.
Right. Well, don't get me wrong. I don't think this is a bad performance. I think she hits a lot of the right emotional notes. As you previously said, the ending, I think, is definitely strong for her, where she is particularly frustrated with not finding answers that she wants. But yeah, there are just a few moments where it feels like Jane Fonda acting more so than Lillian Hellman, unfortunately.
Capital A acting.
Yes, actressing, as we like to say.
Yes. I mean, Jane Fonda does that. I don't know if you guys saw the morning after her movie from 1986, which is her last Oscar nomination. But the Criterion Channel had a Jane Fonda, and I watched them all because I love her. And in that movie, she's also doing a turn. She's doing a capital A acting. She's playing a drunk, and it's a very physical drunk performance. And sometimes it works, and sometimes you're like, Jane, what's going on? But I just loved it for just the sheer spectacle of watching an actor act. But unfortunately, unlike the morning after, this was not a fun watch. You are watching an actor act, but it's not fun because what they're doing is not fun as good character work. It's not fun as just capital A acting.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to this preview of On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup-is and become a patron. Only $3 a month will get you access to bonus episodes, a Slack channel, and early access to regular episodes. Thank you so much for your consideration.